The subject I'm talking about this evening, my interest in this really started when I was studying XOS. I mean, I've been interested in Islamic geometric design for a long, long time, but it's only when I did my master's with Doris Abu Saif as my supervisor that I gained a more profound interest, if you will. So what I want to talk about this evening is obviously Mamluk geometric design, but that's the narrow context, really. There's also a wider context, which is what can we learn by looking more closely at these patterns? And the Mamluks lend themselves for that very well, for reasons that hopefully will become clear. And what Karen also alluded to, there's also a lot of interesting educational opportunities attached to Mamluk geometric design specifically, but more generally to Islamic geometric design. And I want to show that a bit as well, because that's what I do a lot of in my workshops and in my books. You know, when teaching about this subject, there's of course the cultural aspect. You can teach about the heritage of a particular part of the world, but you can also bring in other subjects like maths, but in a fun way, creativity, etc. So there's all sorts of interesting things that sort of will fit into this this subject. So, well, maybe a show of hands. Who's been to Cairo? So, quite a lot of people. Well, Cairo is great, of course, and especially if you're interested in Islamic geometric design or even Islamic architecture. You can't walk for 10 meters without tripping over one masterpiece or another. And the fact that it's all so visible and so ubiquitous makes it very interesting and sort of raises all sorts of questions which are fun to try and answer. So I've tried to do it a little bit chronologically, because I was thinking before, well, how can we keep this interesting without making it samey for people who are introduced to this subject for the first time. So I've tried to keep it a little bit chronologically. I mean, Islamic geometric design in itself is interesting because it's very interdisciplinary. It doesn't really have an academic home. You know, art historians take an interest, but they recognize it as being Islamic geometric design, but not much more than that. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have mathematicians who take an interest in Islamic geometric design and Mamluk geometric design, but they take out all the embellishments and just treat it as black lines on a piece of paper, and then use their mathematical analysis on that. Well, of course, it's not about that. It's an art form, it's a visual culture, and it sits in between those two things. So, in my presentation, I'll be focusing on very specific patterns, but it's important to keep in mind, of course, that the composition isn't the little geometric panel, it's the building on which this panel appears. You know, these patterns exist in context with each other, in context of an urban environment in the case of Cairo, and I think it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not just narrowly focused on the geometric pattern, but it's also how does this pattern exist with other patterns. So, the Mamluks are fantastic in their artistic and architectural output, and it's not just the subject this evening, geometric design, that is interesting. It's also the tiles that they made, the domes that they embellished, the minarets that they made. There's an enormous richness of things to look at, and one of the reasons is that the Mamluks reigned from 1250 to 1517, and in that period of 2.5 centuries, there were a lot of different sultans who ruled, and they were quite, there was a lot of political intrigue, and a lot of these sultans sought to establish their legitimacy, but also their piety through the works that they built. And typically they would not go for the construction of one monumental mosque, but instead they would build a lot of smaller things. And that's why we now have such a richness of things to look at. So, the three things that I really want to focus on tonight is, well, excellence, of which there is an abundance. Secondly, what we can learn by looking more closely. This applies to Islamic geometric design in general, but it's more fun to apply to the Mamluks because they were so excellent in that. And then lastly, what is the legacy, or what should the legacy be of Mamluk geometric design? Sort of looking at the now and what we could do with what we know. So, this is not Mamluk. There are so many other eras that regions that I could have looked at. You know, it's not like the Mamluks are the only ones who demonstrate excellence in this field. Far from it. You know, almost all dynasties, all eras have made fantastic works in architecture, in art. The amazing thing is that they all had this standard of excellence, this adherence to best practice, that was the same across 1,000 years across the whole Islamic world. And it's only now, in the 21st century, that you don't have that anymore, and that's one of the issues we'll talk about later. So, briefly, this is in Turkmenistan. This is in near Jericho, West Bank. This is in one of the caravanserais in Anatolia, and that's in Istanbul. So all these eras are interesting in their own ways, all these regions are interesting in their own ways, and you can see that it's not just about the geometric patterns, it's how do you make these patterns more beautiful? What do you do with it to embellish them? You know, that's as much part of this subject as just seeing it as a number of lines on a piece of paper that make a pattern. This is Agra, and this is Iran. Also a fantastic building. So I could have done a similar presentation almost about any of these eras. You know, there's plenty enough to look at in all of these different eras and parts of the Islamic world. But we're not doing that, we're looking at the Mamluks. So before I do though, I wouldn't be an educator if I didn't try and give a little bit of general context, because I want to not just show pretty pictures, but also talk a little bit about how can we teach ourselves to look better, rather than just recognizing a pattern. If you want to sort of create a path where you can keep teaching yourself more in this field, it's nice if you can create a little bit of a foundation for yourself. So I put 3 or 4 slides together. So if you forget all the slides and you only want to remember one, then remember this one. Okay, so this is my Islamic geometry family tree. Principle being that every pattern starts as a circle. And the first creative choice that you make, for you if you're making a pattern, but you know, this is true for the past 1,000 years, the first creative choice that you make is into how many equal sections do I divide my circle. And that puts you on a particular path that you then stay on. So if your creative choice is to divide your circle into 4 equal parts, or 8, or 16, or 96 for that matter, that yields, for example, some of these shapes. So this is a very familiar shape, of course, it's 8-pointed star, I've already seen that. Octagons, 16-pointed stars, a little cross shape that sits next to that, and other shapes as well. If you divide your circle into 4 equal parts, it allows you to create a very large range of 4-fold patterns. More about that later. Alternatively, you can divide your circle into 6 equal parts. That then yields, for example, some of those shapes. And the greatest diversity, the greatest richness of patterns you would find there. There's lots and lots of 6-fold patterns. Or you could decide to divide your circle into 5 or 10 equal parts, which, for example, yields this 5-pointed star, this pentagon, or these 2 different kinds of 10-pointed stars. 90% of any pattern you will ever see in Islamic art or architecture will be this, that, or that. And there's 10% which sort of sits there, which is everything else, basically. So 7-pointed stars, 11-pointed stars, 13-pointed stars, all these things exist, but they're about 10% of what you would see. So if you can recognize what you're looking at the next time you see something, it's really helpful, because if you can say, okay, this is an 8-fold pattern, it means that you can then recognize other 8-fold patterns and you can sort of see how they differ, how they're similar, and it's sort of a good route to learning. So connected to that is how do you make these patterns? So this belongs to 4-fold. So if you can make a little pattern in the square, then you can tessellate it, you can repeat it, and you can make something bigger. That's basically the principle. So with any pattern, and I'll show you some real examples of that, with any pattern there's the visible layer, and then there's the invisible layer. The invisible layer is the grid, which can be a simple grid of squares, or it can be a grid of hexagons, or it can be a combination of squares and hexagons and triangles, or whatever. But there's always something going on in the background that's helped craftsmen create patterns or create compositions. The middle one is the odd one out. So the grid of pentagons, of course, doesn't work. Because you can see that you can tessellate this infinitely, you can tessellate that infinitely, but this you can't, because you get gaps, it doesn't work. Nevertheless, craftsmen, Mamluk craftsmen, but many others as well, when they really wanted to do something that hadn't been done before, they would do it in here, in fivefold geometric design. Precisely because it's more difficult, but also more rewarding when you pull it off. So, fivefold geometric design is the odd one out. It's also quite often the most interesting one. And the Mamluks did loads of fivefold patterns in lots of interesting ways. So, how do you know what you're looking at? Well, there's this lovely little Mamluk, what I call a petal. Of course, it's not the real term, but this would have had a wooden border around it. You just count, really. So when you look at a pattern, you look at these petal shapes, for lack of a better word, and you count how many you see. So if you see a star pattern like that, you just go put 10 petals, therefore it's fivefold. If there had been 8, it would be fourfold. If there were 16, it would also be fourfold. So 12 is a bit different, 12 is a bit ambiguous because it can be two things at the same time, but that's an easy thing that you can always do. Just count. So when you see something like this, you can count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it's a 10-fold pattern. Okay. When you see something like this, Contextual, you can see these windows and you can count, even if you don't see petals, you look for things that are identical. So you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Little 6-pointed star in the middle, hexagons, here 6 hexagons. So then you know that this pattern and this pattern are part of the same family, if you will. And why that's important, or why that's useful to know, I'll show it more detail. So, this is the door of the same building. So, you can see, hopefully, this is an 8-pointed star. This is, well, the shapes aren't quite identical, but you can count these little shapes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's a door with a 4-fold pattern. With a pattern like this, you know that there's a grid going on in the background. The question is, what does that grid look like? How can we imagine that grid to look like? And it's an important question in the case of the Mamluks, because as we'll see later, the Mamluks really played with this idea. They really used this idea of grids as a way to engage with an audience, seemingly. So there's something going on in the background. The way you would make something like this, just briefly, is show you step by step. There. So this corresponds to that. Hopefully you can see. So the grid is made of squares. You draw this thing once, you put them next to each other, and then you end up with something bigger. And how big you make it depends on how many squares you use and how big your square is to begin with. But the beauty of doing it like this, and the premise being that craftsmen weren't mathematicians. They didn't calculate, partly because they didn't have to calculate. So as long as you can draw circles and lines, you can make these patterns. And if you want to make a big pattern, you start with a big circle. If you want to make a small pattern, you start with a small circle. The way you draw is always the same. So that makes it much easier to plan. Does that make sense? The interesting thing with, for example, this this is the Crown of Salt and Vipers, I think that's the one that's also in the British Library, that they put online, is that you see so many examples where beauty doesn't equate to complexity, if you see what I mean. So it's never about how complex can I make a pattern, how complicated can I make something. You know, it's more about the visual impact. So this is a very simple pattern, made more or less at the same time as a door for the same sultan. This is just a straightforward 8-pointed star, not very difficult to draw at all. This is much more difficult. This is a 12-pointed star connected with a 9-pointed star, so very difficult to do. Not only that, what you see, and that's one of the intriguing things generally in Islamic geometric design, is that everything is always made to measure. So it's never that you have a door panel and you have a pattern and you just chop it off when there's no more space left. It's never like that. It's always designed to fit width and height. And you can see that because you put quarter stars on the corners here, there, or half stars on the sides. So that means that you need to know exactly how big, what the scale is going to be of your pattern before, so that it will fit. So when you don't, the instances where you don't see this is stuff that's being made now, basically. So this is the same structure, also 12-pointed stars combined with 9-pointed stars, but you know, with a very different appearance, even though it's the same thing. So by counting, you start to see similarities, even though this wooden door looks very different from that metal door. It's less different than you would think if you look a bit more deeply, or if you count at least. And also you can see here quarter stars in the corners. They've got lots of these doors in the Louvre, and I think the back is just as nice as the front. So they've got, I don't know how many they've really got loads on display, and it's fascinating to see front and back of these doors. So this is the same building. I mean, we can pretend that it's all sweetness and light, but there's also lots of examples of things that are being threatened at the moment, especially things in Cairo. And you know, this is one example. This is the same building as where those doors in the Louvre came from. I mean, it needs a little bit of TLC. Okay, so I wanted to look at a few buildings that give us clues, or give us, I think, visual messages. And if you consider that everything that you would do in a geometric pattern is deliberate, designing it to fit in a door, designing it to fit in the window aperture, it's all designed, it's all made to measure. So there's really nothing random about it at all, and it would be wrong to assume that there was. So when you walk around Cairo and you see a lot of these patterns, it's worth to think, well, what is the point of this? Why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? There must be a reason, and it's for us to figure out what that reason is. So the Mosque Madrasa of Sultan Hassan is especially interesting. Beautiful building, of course. You can see this lovely 12-fold pattern, which I do in my workshops as well. You can see this is one of those patterns that is very ubiquitous across Islamic art and architecture. You can see this pattern in the Alhambra, you can see this pattern in Anatolia, you can see this pattern in Agra. And the interesting thing with patterns, of course, is the question, was there a transfer of knowledge or what? You know, how did that work? How would that knowledge, or how would these patterns, what's the explanation for these patterns appearing 2,000 miles apart, 400 years apart? I think for a lot, well, not a lot, but there are plenty of patterns like this one, which you would discover if you were playing around with a ruler and a pair of compasses. And you can imagine that the people who made these patterns, their job was to create patterns and compositions, and some patterns just reveal themselves while you're trying different things. So if you start with a circle, it's divided into 12 equal parts, you draw 4 triangles, you try something else, some things will just appear. And I don't think you need to look too hard for some sort of transfer of knowledge, because they can be independently arrived at, and that's one of those patterns right there. The intriguing thing is when you see patterns where that's not the case, or compositions where you think, well, this is just too idiosyncratic to make it likely that 2 different people or 3 different people would have arrived at that particular pattern. It just seems very unlikely. So these doors used to be in the mosque of Salmanassa, now they're somewhere else. You can see that there's, well, let's count what we're looking at here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 pointed star, and then this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, so 4, we're going to count the whole thing, 12 and 16 pointed stars combined. Again, you can see half stars here, quarter stars on the corners, all made to measure, and very difficult to do, really difficult to do. Even for us with the computer, you think it would be easier. Of course, they didn't have that, and they, I would argue, had a compass and a ruler, and they managed it, and more complex besides. And of course, the trick is to, best practice is that lines should always go somewhere. You can't, lines when they get to the intersection should go in a straight line. You can't get 3 lines converging on 1 point, things like that. So all those rules are adhered to. And the creativity that the Mamluks demonstrated many times is how do you connect everything? How do you join everything up? Because you can draw this in isolation, that's not so difficult. You can draw that in isolation, that's also not so difficult. But how do you stick it all together so that it makes sense and that it fits, so that you've got half stars and quarter stars in the corners, and that it's balanced. So this is next to the entrance into Sultan Hassan Mosque, and there's a, as you can see, a niche here on the outside, which is very intriguing because it shows something that you're not supposed to see, or that you would normally never see, which is, and you can see this pattern here. There's black lines and then there's lighter lines. The black lines show the grid, which you're not supposed to see. The white lines show the pattern, which you are supposed to see. So this is the grid, that's the black lines, and then this is the pattern, that's the white lines. And it shows how, instead of using a grid of squares, which of course are hexagons, which is the most simple way to create a bigger pattern, they also use a grid, but they use a bespoke grid, which they've had to squeeze things to make it work. So you've got a big octagon in the middle, you've got quarter octagons on the corners, and you've got this little weird shape. And there's 3 shapes, and each shape has its own ingredient, basically. And that's how they managed to make that work. And what you see is that if you were to analyze this mathematically, you would find lots of weirdness, things that don't add up. But that's not the point. The point is to make something with visual impact. The point is to make something that's beautiful rather than something that mathematicians or geometrists would approve of. And they've had to sort of squash things a little bit, but that's fine because it works. The interesting thing is that this is even visible at all, and why it is. I know of one other instance, which I'll show you in a minute, but I mean this is almost unique, and it's interesting to wonder why that is. Was this the master and the apprentice who were working on this, and the master gave the drawings to the apprentice under some time pressure that look, go knock this thing together, and the apprentice didn't understand what was supposed to be visible and what was supposed to be invisible. So it's possible. It's also interesting to think, well, how would the other craftsmen have reacted when they saw this? You're an idiot. This is supposed to be. It's a trade secret, in fact, because you never see that. But of course, it's very helpful because now we do see how they put that together. This is the other instance. This is in the Lakma, Los Angeles County Museum. They put this 13th century Iranian tile, which is really, well, just as unique as this, basically. You can see that these bold lines, here's a little bow tie shape, which is pretty much, well, actually, but you've got this quarter 10 decagon here. These bold lines are the grid, and then over on top of that is a more visible pattern. But it's very unusual to see that. You really you never see that really. This is also at Sultan Hassan Mosque. So this is also a panel as you come in, and this is quite unique to the Mamluks. There's really no other instances of in other eras or other places where you see not a complete pattern but part of a pattern. So instead of having a panel with a central star with whatever things going around it, you can see, hopefully you can see, there's half a star here. You see that? Or alternatively there's a quarter star here and a quarter star there. So, but it's framed as if it's got a big elaborate border around it. So what's the point of that? Would be the question, why would they do that? Is it this is a joke between craftsmen, is it some sort of reference that only they would understand? Or, considering the ubiquity of these geometric patterns in Cairo, is it something that the local Cairenes were so well versed in that they could see that and that they knew, this is referring to that, or this is supposed to be that if I visualize this as a tessellation. So this, of course, you can make it into a pattern by going like that. You mirror it, and then you have a complete star. So I'll show you, like that. So this makes that. So this is that, as you can see. So now you have a complete pattern. So what's the point of that? Is it referring to something, or is it just something to challenge the audience? So this pattern you don't see in Cairo in its entirety, but you do see it somewhere else. So you see it here. So this is the Mustansari madrasa in Baghdad. This is that. As you can see, it's sort of connected up differently because where this thing stops, that's this bit, but it connects to another one next to it. But that pattern sits there. This is one of those patterns where you think, well, it's very hard to imagine that these patterns would be arrived at independently. It's a bit too idiosyncratic for that. It's hard to imagine. Not just that, it also refers to this mosque. So in the dome, this is that as well. So there's two instances at least that are extant where you can see that half pattern that Sultan Hassan was referring to a complete pattern that you can then find in Konya and in Baghdad. Something else that refers to Konya. So this is the South Atta Mosque, one of my favorite buildings in Turkey, pretty fantastic. You can see it's got this quite unusual minaret with this pattern with these turquoise blues and these arrows pointing in opposite directions up and down and left to right. This is the minaret of Al-Ghuri at Al-Azhar Mosque. This one. So this looks a lot like that, doesn't it? It really looks a lot like that. So is that then, did the Mamluk craftsman also refer to something else from Konya by using this sort of treatment from the outside? It's possible. You get a lot of this in Cairo as well. You might have seen this. You have these voussoirs, which are alternating between floral motif and geometric motif. The same thing applies to these two. You see a little bit of a pattern, and then you can visualize what that would be if you mirrored it, for example. So if we take this one, for example, this can be mirrored like that, and then you see another example of it also somewhere else in Cairo. This pattern, though, is, even though there's one example here in Cairo, this is a typical North African Andalusian pattern that you wouldn't expect to see in Cairo. Now you would see it here, you can see these odd little shapes here, you can see those here. This is in, this is from the Alcazar, I think. So there are certain shapes, if you're studying this subject, certain shapes that you would associate with particular styles and particular eras. So to see something like this in Cairo, to me, is unusual or odd even, because they go, why? You know, this is not a pattern that they would typically use, but they're referring to it nevertheless. And then lastly, in the case of this building, but certainly not least, this is still Sultan Hassan Mosque, and on the outside, you've got these weird things. So what's that all about? You know, that's also something. You know, it's an unusual shape. It's so unusual. It must mean something. It must be some sort of reference. But then they say, well, what is that reference? So there's a thing enlarged. So you can see it's a 5-pointed star. It's got a pattern going around it, and weirdly enough, it's set in a square. So that is more or less that. So this is something that you can tessellate with the aid of another little shape. If you do, you get something like that. So that's in Yaz, in Iran. So that's that. So those two big square things on the outside of Sultan Hassan there, well, certainly if they're not referring to this pattern, they're referring to a pattern like that, which is something that you would see in Iran. You know, there's other instances of that pattern, but you wouldn't see it in Egypt, that's for sure. Or anywhere else in the Middle East for that matter. Okay. So, another lovely building. Beautiful ceiling, beautiful door. And interestingly, the border treatment is more or less the same. It's the same pattern, except that here it's half of what this is, but it's the same pattern. Take my word for that. So that's interesting. You think, did they coordinate their design efforts to do that? I'll talk a little bit more about this pattern in a little while as well, because that's a particularly interesting one as well. So after a while, when you study this, you have a repertoire of images in your head, or patterns in your head, where when you see, you go, okay, that looks like that, or that looks like that. And the interesting thing is, was that also the case for these Mamluk craftsmen? You know, if this was their job, then that's presumably all they did. So, did they see drawings from overseas craftsmen from faraway places who showed them patterns that they had made, and then they thought, that's nice, I'm going to use it next time I build something, or what? You know, it's hard to know how that works, but I think they did do that. So, Mamluk Quran. So this is an example of a, well, this is a tenfold pattern, as I'm sure you all agree. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Quarter stars on the corners. I've got a YouTube video on how to draw this, by the way. So this is the kind of pattern that you see all over the Islamic world. But in Cairo, you only see it used in a very limited number of ways. For example, on Quran pages, but then also here and there and there. So you can see that this little rectangle represents one of those, but then rotated and much smaller. So sometimes you see that things that you can repeat are also considered to be beautiful enough to be compositions on their own. This being a good example. You know, you could make a very big composition by just tessellating this thing infinitely, but you know they I've treated it as a standalone composition that doesn't need to be something bigger. but then they do use it in a much smaller way as something that you can tessellate like that. And then cleverly also something that sits on a concave surface. So the Mamluks also made a lot of beautiful bookbindings, but the photos are often so brown that you can hardly put them on the presentation. This is a particularly nice one though, and you can also see here that we've got a 10-pointed star here in the middle. But the reason I've chosen this one is that there's a certain little design element that you wouldn't associate with Mamluk design, or put it differently, you would associate with something else rather than Mamluk, which is this little thing here in the middle, where you have these 5 shapes and then this pentagon in the middle. So that little thing there, which is more or less the same as that little detail on another Mamluk Quran page, slightly different. That little shape you can see in a pattern like this, that pattern is most well known from a building in Iran, a tomb tower or Maraga, which mathematicians love to write about that particular building because it has that particular pattern and it looks very complex. It is quite complex, but it's certainly something that's very unusual. Not something that you see all over the Islamic world, and certainly not something that you see in architecture in Cairo, but on this particular bookbinding you do see it. So that's a little visual thing that they picked up from somewhere else, probably, and then decided to use there.
Sorry, is there a name for that pattern again?
What's that?
Is there a name for that pattern again?
No, patterns don't really have, well, in Farsi patterns, some patterns do have names, but I
Thank you.
particularly nice building which has a beautiful courtyard and very unusually has a stone minbar which has several little panels in here that refer to things. This one certainly does. And then this one is a stone copy of a minbar in Mosque Madrasa of Al-Ghuri, where you have, I think that's right, where you have 2 7-pointed stars, like twins basically, that hold on to each other and make everything join up. So to make something like that in stone is, well, very difficult, of course. There's a detail. So you can see. I chose this little close-up because it shows a device that the Mamluks used to get away with things that you really shouldn't be able to get away with. So they use these little card shapes, and they're like links in a chain. So instead of having, if you imagine if you have a star pattern like this where everything is joined up, if you change something, it affects the whole pattern. So it's very hard to tweak something that's a traditional star pattern. However, if you have a pattern where everything is made up of a card-shaped link, you can easily make it a little bit flatter, a little bit longer, squeeze it, and you're only changing one thing, everything else can stay the same. So you can see them doing this. So you can see, this one is a lot longer than that one. This one's a lot flatter than that one. And the reason that's the case is precisely for that reason. They want to make everything join up. They want all these patterns all onto each other, but the only way you can really do that is if you use these little card shapes that you then manipulate to make everything join up. You can see them here as well. So here's another one. There's another one. So this pattern is basically this pattern, but then it's sort of wrapped around a column, turned like that and like that. The interesting thing is, of course, it doesn't also join up at the back where you can't see the column. That's what you don't always know. With domes, of course, it is. We'll look at domes a bit later. Oh, beautiful minbar in this Madrasa Khanka. I think there's some bits that have been stolen here and they've draped something over it, sadly. But then this panel is very interesting because this looks like something that you're supposed to read to me. You have all these little things going on. There's a pattern here, then there's a little pattern there, there's things going on behind that column. Well, the question is there something there that you're supposed to interpret? Is it just something, oh, that's nice to look at, or is there more to it than that? There probably is more to it than that, but then the trick is trying to figure out what that is. And these are references to other patterns or other buildings. So the Mamluks made a lot of beautiful domes, like this one, and a lot of them have geometric patterns, some of them just have floral patterns. And you can see, interestingly, there's a real progression in the skill. So the earlier domes, you can see that they have a particular way of making, because the trick is, of course, how do you put a pattern on a dome? Because it has to look good all the way around. In the beginning, apparently, according to an article which I think is probably right, they divided the dome up into little squares, and where the dome was more narrow, they divided up into triangles. And each square, each triangle had a little bit of an ingredient. When it got more complicated, they did what they do in many other parts of design as well. You divide it up into 1/8, like a slice like this, and then you design it accordingly. And you can also see that, because if you look closely, it's fun. I think people like this sort of thing, to see where these slices join up. You know, there's always a little bit of weirdness or something that you wouldn't intentionally design like that. But they would design it in a slice in 1/8, plan the whole thing on one slice, and then design all the stones off-site or on the ground, and then build it. So I found a nice photo when I was in this presentation where you can see these chaps with like a disassembled dome, it seems. But you can see that, you know, it's all, because you can plan the whole dome, because if you're going to do one course of stones and it's divided into 8 pieces, then you know you're going to do a lot of identical stones, and then later you just put it together. Well, this is just a really beautiful tile, which I thought should be on here. Yeah, it combines calligraphy, geometry, it's a beautiful composition. It's just a knockout, I think. And the way that they make everything sort of intertwined, it's really very skillful. Of course, it's also very tricky to make all these things interlace properly. You know, it's very easy to make a mistake, because it has to be over, under, over, under. If you're doing something as complicated as this, you know, it's easy to commit to an incorrect line. I'm sure if we look, we could see something that they had to correct.
It's like Celtic.
It is like Celtic, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And you can see that even here the craftsman has tried to put quarter stars on the corners just because it's considered to be best practice. So yeah, this line could have gone anywhere, of course, but instead they tried to make it look like that. This is in the northern cemetery of Cairo, in the Necropolis, but it's, you know, it's a very built-up area. You have lots of shops and electricity cables and cars and trucks with flat tires and rubbish and all that stuff. And then in the midst of all that, you have all these wonderful masterpieces, all these fantastic buildings, such as this one with the, this is considered to be the apex, pardon the pun, of Mamluk dome building. It's a fantastic building that combines the straight lines of geometry with the curvilinear lines of, you know, floral embellishment. So Kai is very interesting. He was really my favorite Mamluk often when I was studying at SOAS, because he was really responsible for a lot of buildings, public buildings, minbars, minarets, and he was a very generous patron of the arts. So what I wanted to show here is that, as we saw with the Quran page, sometimes patterns can be standalone, sometimes patterns can be used for something else. So hopefully you can see that this red square is the same as that. So this could be tessellated and then we could create that. This is also the same as that, so you can also chop it in half and then make two doors out of it. Now to to Draw. This is also my first book, by the way. So not everything has to be complex to be beautiful. You know, I mean, this is the door of the funerary complex of Cairo. Very simple design, geometrically significant in the sense that if you're a geometer, you know that if you want to divide a circle into 6 equal parts, that you can draw the same diameter circle 6 times around the initial circle, and that could be interpreted to refer to this. But you can also see in other buildings that you can see certain patterns where compositions recur. Sometimes it's done because the painter of the building that's referring to something earlier wants to demonstrate some sort of allegiance to the original. So this is an Ottoman mosque, classic building, and this of course is the same as that, except with some extra color. I mean, it is not a very complicated pattern, but still, you know, it's the same. You know, almost all detail except for the color, including the treatment of the corners there. This is a fascinating set of buildings. So this is Sabil Kotel, so a public drinking fountain on the ground floor, then a children's school on the top floor, and then there's a pronunciation probably on the right, Kerala here, so some shops there. And all along this building are all sorts of little and larger panels. So there's one here, a panel, geometric panel that goes around the corner, very unusual, like that. So that's the only instance I know of that. Of course, that's also referring, well, it's a complete panel if you look at it as a long composition. But the interesting thing is, of course, that you don't know that if you're coming from this side or from that side. So it's also quite fun in a way. So if you're walking down the street and you only see this part already, maybe already you're thinking, okay, what would that look like if I mirrored it? Then as you get closer to the corner, you can see that the craftsman is on your favor, because you don't need to visualize it, you can see it if you stand like the way we're standing now. You know, it's possible that he used that idea of putting a composition on a corner like that as a way to teach. No, fantastic lintel, really, really great composition. And then little compositions here, 8-pointed star combined with a 6-pointed star for some reason. You see that particular pattern more often. And then interestingly, another really fantastic lintel here with a quite specific pattern, which then is also used on the dome of that little mausoleum in the Northern Cemetery. So that's the same as that. Of course, it's easier to put something on a rectangular composition than on, you know, the curvature of the dome. And then this pattern appears several times, or versions of it. So here it is again, at Amrita's palace. Mosque of Southern Cairo has something similar, not quite the same. So either they just really like that pattern, or there was another reason that they used it several times. Yeah, something on the V&A. So this is a plastic cast on the website. So that's the same thing. So this is another Sabil tab by the same sultan in a different place. This one is more well known for some reason. And we already saw that this panel was on that column I showed. But there's other things going on here that are interesting to look at. For a start, there's this really fantastic column here. This is the bottom of it. Really, really great. I just marvel at the creativity of that. Now that they would think, okay, we need a column. What can we do to make it really excellent? And then they come up with stuff like this. So I wanted to look at this particular panel because that also refers to things, or certainly it can also be used in an educational context, and I often do so because there are certain patterns that show some sort of creative evolution from something simple to something else. I.e. this. So this is a very simple pattern, overlapping hexagons, overlapping 6-sided shapes, which can then be turned into overlapping 12-sided shapes. You see this a lot in Ottoman architecture, very common pattern. And then you can take it one step further and make it into these connected barrel shapes, which is more or less that. So all these three drawings all have the same lines to draw. It's just choosing different bits of line to make it. So it's not hard to imagine that some craftsman sitting with a piece of paper or vellum or parchment or whatever has drawn his pencil lines and thinks, okay, well, I've drawn this thing 100 times, that's going to be a bit boring. What about if I turn these overlapping 6-sided shapes into 12-sided shapes? And then discovers that there are even other lines that he can use or ignore, and something like that. So you can see, if you look for it, the evolution of some of these patterns. Yeah, and then this is the same as that. We saw that earlier, where we saw the ceiling and the door. So this pattern, very ubiquitous in Turkey, generally. And you also see in detail there. And of course, with any kind of pattern, but especially with a 6-fold pattern, is how do you go around the corner that's 90 degrees? And you can see that they come up with a little elegant solution to make it all look nice. Okay, so we're sticking with Sultan Qaitbay a bit longer. This is of course Al-Azhar Mosque, and the Mamluks added a few minarets. This is the minaret of Al-Huri, which has this pattern that we already saw, which alludes to this minaret in Konya. But this is the one I want to look at. So this is the minaret by Qaitbay. And even though if you stand in the courtyard of Al-Azhar, you can only see the top bit basically, a lot of detail is going into the bottom bit, which is this. And you can only see this when you're standing on the roof opposite it, not even when you're standing in the courtyard down below. You don't even see this. It's a really fantastic building. It's really beautiful. But this is what I want to look at. So this is very intriguing because this refers to something. You know, we're being invited to do the same thing as before. We're invited to mirror that. And then if we do, it makes something. But what does it make? So this is that, as you can see. So if you tessellate that, you end up with that, like that. This is quite a common pattern in North Africa, but not in Cairo, or not in Egypt. We never see this, never, in Cairo, except in this little rectangle. So then why would they bother to do that? Not only bother to do it, but bother to put it up where nobody can see it unless you're standing on the roof. At the base, next to the base of this pyramid, above this minaret, it's just the weirdest thing. But it refers to something, and it refers to something from quite far away, or certainly not something that the Mamluks would ever use. So, for example, here this is in Morocco. You can see the same pattern being used on a nice column like that. And then I noticed this. This is a neo-Mamluk mosque, and they've gone. The neo built in the 18th century, but they've made the effort to recreate that little detail, and they put it so that you can see it for a change, rather than on the side where you can't see it. So, in the 18th century, that was also picked up, and they were able to recreate it. So this is the Mosque of Sultan Qaitbay, and you have something similar going on also. If you're standing on the roof next to the base of the minaret, there's also a little something going on there, referring to a pattern. There we go. So that's also something that you could tessellate. You could do it in two ways. You could make it like that. So, for example, that's a little balustrade in Northern Cemetery. You can make a pattern like that if you made it bigger. Or you could do it in a different way, like you have this in the middle, and then you have this Mamluk, this Mamluk around page. So, if somebody saw this, well, why is it in that location for a start? And who is it meant for? Is it meant for just people in Cairo, or is it meant for fellow craftsmen who would be able to understand what the point was of that? And then here you can also see that in all these alternating stone courses that they made the effort to put have good composition on there, and then also make it fit perfectly. Quarter stars here, quarter stars there. So high up, I mean, if you're standing where I'm standing when I took the photo, you can see it, but if you're at the bottom, not much less so, of course. Yeah, so I mean, this is also quite a specific pattern that will probably refer to something. Of course, we only know the buildings that are extant, of course. That's also the interesting thing. There might be lots of buildings that used to be around, patterns that used to be around that are no longer around. So, yeah, so this is the complex of coloring. Now you can see here there's these overlapping 12-sided shapes that's there, for example. And you could have verified an unusual pattern here. So, oh yeah, that's what it was. So, I'm always intrigued. You look at all these patterns and you think, well, what were these guys wearing? You know, where they're so much into geometry that their clothes and such will also have patterns. Because quite often when you see miniature paintings, for example, everybody always has six-fold patterns. And all the domes always have six-fold patterns when they're painted. But you know, why is that? Is that true? Is it just because that's the convention that they did it like that? So here's some fabrics. And there's carpets as well, of course. And of course, I think, so this is a fourfold pattern. This is a fourfold pattern. Carpets also are fourfold, but it's more because that's what the weaving tells you to do, really, because it'd be very hard to do a fivefold pattern or a tenfold pattern if you were weaving something. If you were printing, it's a different story, but you know, that's the limitation I think that you have unless somebody can correct you on that. And these are Mamluk playing cards, which I thought were quite cute. So you can see, there's only one of them as a geometric pattern. There's quite a few different ones online actually, but there's a little fourfold pattern or eight-pointed side there. So, even though this is all very interesting, I think, well, what can we do with this information? For me, I like to teach Islamic geometric design because I think it's an interesting way for people to learn something about Islamic culture in a 100% positive way. And if you can draw something that looks great, you take confidence from that. But what you see with the Mamluks and also with other dynasties is that they were so creative, they were innovative, they wanted to try new things. So this is of course a beautiful composition, but then to come up with the crazy idea to make this orb on top of a minaret and try and put a composition like that on it, and to succeed, it's quite something. So the creativity was very important, I think, and even though there are a lot of people, or quite a few people, who like to create these patterns, and certainly in the last 2 or 3 years you see a lot of these patterns in fashion. You can go to Sainsbury or to the Asda, you can find a frock with an Islamic geometric pattern on it, even high fashion, Chanel and Blahnik use a lot of these patterns. But all those instances are just about recreating things that have been made 400 years ago. And because Islamic geometric design is seen as a traditional craft that's being threatened, the knee-jerk response seems to be, we must preserve it. And preserving means we must be able to recreate it. Well, the thing that really needs to be preserved is this innovative ethos where they made new things. And that's the most important thing. So I put this one on here because this also shows these voussoirs in this building. They show, this little voussoir shows a pattern that I can't place. And to me that's intriguing because it refers to something, no doubt. So either it refers to something that's a pattern that I don't know, or a pattern that's not extant anymore, but it's very under research. There are a lot of things we can learn or research without having to, well, just by looking, really. This is another good example, nice Mamluk minaret, which has a pattern on here, which is a tweak, if you will, of that. So they use this pattern, but then they modified it a little bit to make that sort of creativity and innovation, these beautiful compositions. That's really the challenge, I think, for now, because the challenge is that I think for Islamic geometric design as well. One is theft. This, sadly, you know, I mean, this is not the only environment that looks like that. You know, this stuff that's, especially now that Cairo is a relatively, well, what's the word? Well, a place where these things are possible. You know, it's a tragedy. The other challenge is bad design. So this is Wafi Mall in Dubai. This is supposed to be a Mamluk composition. I mean, I can see what they're trying to do. It's a pattern from a door, just done really badly. And you can see, you know, these shapes have to be symmetrical. We've seen that. They have to be uniform, you know, and this is a fat one, this is a thin one, this line sort of bounces off there. It's rubbish, basically. And I have a Pinterest board with loads of examples of bad designs. You're welcome to have a look. No, it's sad because there is interest in architecture and in design to use Islamic geometric patterns, but there's one pattern that you see a lot. Well, the number of different patterns that you see, you can count on the fingers of two hands, basically. Even though there's hundreds that you could use, the ones that I use are the ones that they can copy and paste from online. And this is one particular pattern that I kept seeing used on all sorts of products, and I thought, why are they choosing this pattern? You know, why specifically this? Turns out it's the pattern that's on the cover of that book by Jules Bourgoin. I don't know if you know this. It's a Dover publication. That pattern that gets copied the most is the one that's on the cover, so they just downloaded it from Amazon and traced it. The challenge is to teach it in such a way that people can know the rules and break them. You know, and I think that another challenge is what I call stasis, that the focus is so much on preserving what there is, and the school that does teach it just teaches pupils how to recreate things, partly because it's considered to be hubristic to try anything else, but you know, I think that's nonsense. You know, I mean, if you look at the hundreds of years of this design tradition, they were always trying to do new things. That's really that's the main legacy, not so much it's beautiful and so perfect. You know, we shouldn't even try to do something else. We should try to do something else, as long as we know what the rules are, so that we can break them in an informed way, rather than in a way that's informed by not knowing. So, lastly, as I said, it's a very good way to teach about lots of different things. You can teach about heritage, you can teach about mathematics, you can teach about creativity. I teach a lot of workshops in schools, and everybody gets it. Well, usually if it's a group of 30, there's always one person who doesn't get it, despite my best efforts. But typically everybody gets it. And you know, you make something that's recognizably part of their heritage. You do it in a group, everybody makes the same pattern. It ticks a lot of boxes, and you can also teach a little bit of math in an applied way. So we do this pattern, for example, which is this one, as you can see, hopefully. That's the same one again. And it's very satisfying for people of all ages to make something that looks great and that you can see elsewhere. That's this one you saw earlier. So this is here's one I made earlier. This is a neon star that I made for an exhibition in Bradford last year. So I think it's like that. This is the same as that. And that, to me, that's always been the most appealing thing when I started out on my path of Islamic geometric design, that it can look very contemporary. Now, even though it's 700 years old, you can make it look like something that's very 21st century, because it's so graphically bold, and there's lots of interesting ways that you can do that. Yeah, so when I teach, I do it in the same way that I explained. So people draw something that fits in a square or hexagon, typically. Everybody works with the same template, so everybody's square is the same size. And you just draw your lines with a pencil and then with a marker. And then when you're finished, you put them all together and hey, presto, you've got something that's much bigger. And it's also a group effort. So It's and it makes it accessible. You know, this pattern you can see in the Alhambra. Next time kids see something from the Alhambra, they can say, "I know how to do that." You know, it's fun. I did a workshop in Bradford a couple of months ago where I first did a session for the parents, mums as the case turned out, and they were so keen that they also joined the workshop. They didn't also go home. Yeah, and then there's other things that educationally. This is something in the Freer Gallery, fantastic tile. Of course, it's a geometric tile, so this would have been part of something. So, you know, you can deduct what that was, which is a pattern like this, which is which looks very much like the one that we looked earlier. So this thing would have sat there, and then it would have been accompanied by two other tiles, a little triangle thing here, probably, and then a six-pointed star here. So there's a lot of things that. Because it's because it doesn't have an academic home, it doesn't. The opportunities there for analysis are not being taken. So far, I suppose, but it's a shame because it's interesting. You know, something like a mathematical concept like a root 3 rectangle doesn't have to be boring if you can relate it to something practical like this. So, for example, this is a pattern, a six-fold pattern. You can say, well, there's a proportion in there that craftsmen would have used when they were planning their composition. You know, they would know that if they were making a six-fold pattern, they could take a rectangle of any size, as long as it was that proportion, and anything that they designed would fit. So, something like that. Bukarnos, very interesting. So that's another thing that is very under-researched, basically three-dimensional Islamic geometric design, unique to Islamic architecture. And also something that could do with a little bit of reinvigoration. So I have a YouTube video on how to make that as well, just with a compass and a little X-Acto knife. Yeah, and then this mathematically, or arithmetically I should say, 12-pointed stars relates to these concepts as well. So a 12-pointed star can be made by drawing 4 triangles, or 3 squares, or 2 hexagons, and they all create specific shapes that you can recognize in patterns. So